Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to our February episode of Between the Brackets. In this episode, we have Bryce Howitson and Noble Ackerson joining us to discuss how using a repeatable design thinking process, such as using Google Design Sprints, helps different organizations and software teams build things that matter. But before we get really started in that, I wanted to remind everyone, so what we do here at the Google Developers North America ecosystem team, we look after the community programs and developer outreach here in North America. So things like Google Developer Groups, or GDG for short, Developer Student Clubs, DSC for short, or Google Developer Experts, GDEs for short. And so if you want to learn more about these programs, hit that link right there in the lower third here. We also have a Women Tech Makers program, also known as WTM, where we have a home for all developer backgrounds, all developer types, and we hope to see you out in the community, virtually or in person, whenever we're able to do that again. We also want to share some hope out there to all of our friends across the Midwest that are experiencing these cold temperatures and power outages, water issues, stuff like that. So hopefully everyone is staying safe, warm, and okay. During the show, and I'll repeat this a few times, but during the show, we always welcome live questions. So if you're joining us on YouTube Live, there's a chat right there on the side. And yes, go ahead and submit any of your questions that you have for our guest speakers. You could ask them throughout the show, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. But please ask the questions. All our guest speakers always love hearing from the audience. So, and with that, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bryce and Noble to the stage. Welcome, fellas.
Hey, Kyle.
Hey, Kyle. How you doing?
Good, great. I'm trying to stay warm myself, but hopefully both of you are doing well and had a great week. Great Valentine's week.
Absolutely. It's been a short one, but a jam-packed week for sure.
Yeah, I've had a similar one. I was wondering if we were going to have therapy for our week, or if we're going to talk about all the little problems that we solved with design sprints.
That's awesome. Right. This is an escape, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. An escape to try and break away from work, but still talk about work in a in a more fun fashion. Yeah, the fun parts of work. So both of you are design sprint masters, and you've been through the Google Design Sprint course. I believe, was it 2-3 years ago? And you've been still conducting design sprints as part of your daily jobs and projects that you work in. Go ahead and talk a little bit about your background. Like what are some of the things that you do on a day-to-day that involve these design sprint patterns?
Go ahead. We're both scared to go first. We're just discussing figuring out what it is we do. Simple terms, I work to help businesses and product teams and service teams do better, essentially, right? I look for the strategies that will help develop a better product or a better service, and essentially move a business forward. And I do that sometimes with code, sometimes with words and writing strategies and creating structures. I also do a lot of visual design and things like that. So that background, that design thinking background, is kind of something I apply to all of the people that I work with. And I'm a consultant, so I work with all kinds of different groups, different problems, different business structures. You name it, it's always a different week. It's kind of cool.
Gotcha. Would you say that it's, do you have a particular industry that you primarily operate in, or with your consultancy?
Well, I'm in Minnesota, and I've lucked out that Minnesota sort of is the health tech and healthcare hub of the United States. So I have done an awful lot of healthcare related. But other than that, no, I tend to focus on smaller businesses, helping their audience understand what it is they offer and why they offer it, and then conversely helping them understand what their audience wants and how to be better.
Awesome. Cool. And Noble, how about you?
Hi,
Give a little
yeah.
bit about your background.
I'm so glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this all week. So I'm part of the leadership team, the product leadership team at Ventera, a corporation that's in Northern Virginia. And I set strategy and lead product initiatives for commercial and federal customers out there. I applied design sprints in larger enterprises like federal government, can't get larger than that in some cases. In startups, for my background came from the startup world, and so I applied. After leaving that world, I went back to pay it forward by helping other younger startups, minority-based startups, to figure out problems and how to shortcut their path to innovation, if you want to use jargon. But most recently, I've applied design sprints in larger nonprofits. Like the National Democratic Institute of International Affairs. Boy, that's a mouthful. It's an international development NGO, works outside of the US in a lot of different countries, pretty much every continent. And smaller nonprofits like the Justice Collective in Oakland that brings a lot of equity, equity-based issues for Black and brown and underrepresented folks, for customers like Whole Foods and stuff like that in Oakland. And that was a fun. I would love to talk about that too. That was a fun design sprint that we did with a clear, big challenge and clear outcomes there. And I guess lastly, you can sort of find me as far as what I do as a product leader. You can find me at the intersection. I'm like sitting squarely with the business. So I consider my function more of a business function, because I basically translate the jargon from the tech team, the engineers, the developers. So I'm an evangelist in a sense, developer evangelist in that sense as part of my role. I'm internally and with our customers. On the design side, you find me, translating a lot of the value, the problems that we're looking to solve. So that sort of ties in perfectly with what we're going to talk about today. And of course, the customer, right? So being able to shadow some of our researchers and just get us close to understanding the pains, see whether we have any painkillers for them, software-wise.
Nice.
I was also a former, I should say, I was a former GDE as well. I'm very proud of that for product strategy.
Yes,
so, yeah.
Yes, definitely. That's how one of the many ways that we know Noble from his great work out in the community. Would you say that you spend most of your time on the developer/engineer side as you're interfacing? Because you mentioned that you're trying to translate a lot of what's happening, not necessarily, but sometimes as part of these design sprints. Are you finding yourself more so helping to translate what the engineers are saying or translate what the design wants to the engineers?
I feel like that question is from that show, The Office, the movie Office Space, where you have the consultants asking the guy, like, so what do you do? And it's like, I'm a people person, man. I'm basically that guy. So basically, I find myself, depends on the day of the week or where the need is more. And it also depends on the organization. In the current organization that I'm with, I find myself a lot with the design and the research teams. Previously, before that, my role was actually product innovation, which is just a fancy way to say they needed me as close, like white and rice with the engineering team, the developers, but be able to, there was this bifurcation of design. It was just like a 2-person team and they were just devalued, and engineers always ran after the shiny thing, as any scientist would do. Oh, new framework, let's use that. Design system, we don't want that. And so my job was to, help developers differentiate between what was obvious, right? Because it's what we would, as developers, we actually would naturally gravitate to. It's obvious. Let's just use this thing and solve the problem this way versus what was important, which was what we brought in the business, and we brought in, business or the customer's needs or the market needs to basically temper that knee-jerk reaction or that gut reaction, just to deal with the obvious thing first. So a lot of my job is to be the Grim Reaper, to say no, but back that up with data. And so I'm also working, actually, in this job, I'm working closer with the design, but I'm actually working closer with the data team as well. Like I'm very close to that ingest part, understand, how to properly design interfaces to make sure that we're not providing all the information all at once when you don't really need it, and to be in compliance with certain regulations as far as PII, personally identifiable information, and all that stuff. And then working very close with the engineers from sort of architecture and how we sort of put that all together in order to just, govern how we treat people's information as well.
So Noble, I'm guessing that my job and your job are very similar.
Yeah.
I have a code word that I always look for, or kind of a couple of code words for when it's my job to step in. Does this resonate? It's really simple. All you need is anytime somebody minimizes that's my cue. I have to jump in and, just add a date field because it's simple. Well, sure, but what happens on weekends or on leap year?
Right.
Does the process still run? All these questions. This is where this code for come and help, right?
Yeah, at a previous role, I had a similar code word that was interesting. Can't you just? Was one that was one that
simple,
came up quite
just.
often.
Yeah, that's actually what I was talking about with the obvious versus important. Is like the obvious is, can't you just, you can just do this. But when you put that in a full context of things, we tend to, what did the philosopher Mike Tyson say? Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? And so you would look to methods like design sprints, right, to bring in, surface like the thing right in front of your face that may look obvious, but the important piece is the validation of your assumptions, right? Your business hypothesis, that kind of stuff.
On design sprints, can you dive in a little bit? What is a Google design sprint for those tuning in that have no idea what Google design sprints are?
I'll go first. There's a formal definition of it that I can't rattle off the top of my head, but I would answer it as, one of many frameworks to answer like business ideas or business questions, right? But one thing that is often not addressed is that it's once you understand it, it can be very, very flexible, right? It extends another concept called design thinking, and the benefits of that by enabling your team with like just recipes of proven methods to prioritize your riskiest assumptions. Say, for example, if you're going to do an MVP or just test your validate or repudiate an idea, problems that you're looking to solve. And then it will take it a step further with design sprints to help you, prioritize which problems are most important, important versus obvious. Prototype those as part of that workshop. It could be a 1-day thing, a 2-day thing, up to 5-day things, 5-day workshops. If you have the time and the resources, we'll talk about that later. And then learning, right? Just that quick feedback loop of learning and validating those business ideas as well.
Yeah. And, I want to highlight something that you said there is you never got to the build phase as part of that. So these design sprints are that prototyping, iterating. So it's a way to test the theory, the idea that, the team is looking to do. Right.
I like to think of design thinking itself like the 5th grade definition of the scientific method.
Right? I like that.
Yeah. I have an idea. I need to figure out how to do experiments or tests or whatever to understand that idea. And I think that something's going to come out of it, right? Well, that's design thinking in a nutshell. I don't know why we gave it a different name, but the design sprints just formalize that process, right? So Noble mentioned up to 5 days. It's more that there's 5 sections. There's the understanding the problem, concepting and trying to come up with solutions for it,
right.
Testing, prototyping, and understanding the output of that process, right? So design sprints are really just a formal name with a time box around them for something that I think most of us probably do on our own as part of our own creative process. But when we formalize it, that means the entire group can benefit from it too.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, Bryce. I've found sort of design thinking to be like a superset, and a design sprints being something that sort of closes the loop, right? Thinking, like any organization that's successful today will use like a form of design thinking, like whether they call it design thinking or not. If they're successful, they have to have a way to understand and map the problem, right? Like there's so many different, I've heard like a new one, empathy, something or another. Like there's so many ways to do that. And it all comes down to like, do we understand, for people who may not think like a designer or think as a researcher, it helps just a developer, a suit. Apologize for executives. Some of my best friends are suits. Like it helps us all understand the needs, the possibilities with the technology, and the requirements of the business, but it doesn't close the loop with applying that to that, prototype, measure, learn, iterate, that shortcut loop of that build. And again, you're right, Kyle, it abstracts the build stuff, and that could be an output of a design sprint.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to note is that of all the other processes and all the other creative problem-solving techniques we can use, the design sprint focuses on the fact that you are going to make a prototype, you're going to test it, and you're going to learn from it. Obviously, testing is, near and dear to my heart. I think that's super important. Kyle's laughing because he just got my shirt. But I think that's the important part, right? It's that the idea that you're actually going to try something out. You're going to find out if it works or not.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I want to backtrack a little bit and highlight is something that you said, Bryce, where, and Noble, you alluded to this as well, where design thinking is something we all do in one way or another. But with Google Design Sprints, it's something that helps get the whole team on the same page. And so that to me, how you said it really, really resonated to me, and makes what we just call it Google Design Sprints, but I mean that's what it is. It helps get the whole team on the same page. Everybody knows what stage of the process we're in, whether we're iterating the prototype phase, the project plan, and so when you formalize that process, that's what actually gets the whole team, where whatever the team looks like, they're all on the same page.
It also creates transparency in that process too. As a designer, I've often been guilty of doing that process and then taking the results to someone, right? Instead of letting them watch testers completely fail to take money from them or get their COVID shot or whatever it is, right? Like there's all these things that we test and prototype, and often people come in there, they're like, well, we did a design sprint and the idea failed, right? So the sprint wasn't successful. Like, no. That was the best thing you could have gotten out of this.
Exactly.
Failed before you built it. But often we don't take the nitty-gritty pieces of that process to the decision makers, right? We're just like, well, here's what we found out and it didn't work, so we're doing something else. Great.
Why didn't it work?
Right? How do you argue that you should keep doing something or that you should pivot or whatever else when the people that actually make that decision are not part of the process? Design sprints let you do that.
Right.
Yeah. So you brought up a good thing. I ran a design sprint. It failed. The outcome wasn't what we expected. The whole project failed. what are some of the common pitfalls or some things that when you're trying to solve a problem and you run into that failure, do you have examples that you've ran into where you ran a design sprint and like, oh, the idea was actually bad, like this, here we learned a lot on why it was bad? But
I mean, I think that there's a difference between a failure of the idea or solution and a failure of a design sprint.
Right.
Good.
I would say a failure of the idea or the solution is relatively obvious after you go through testing. And that lets you learn and do better. Failure of a design sprint happens when there's a preconceived idea
Boom.
that doesn't match the need or solve the problem, but it's being rammed through. Or I guess personally, I believe that they fail if you don't actually follow the phases and do all the pieces.
Right.
But that's very different than the problem not being
sound.
Right.
Actually, the way you articulated that, Bryce, reminds me of something that stuck with me from our Google Design Sprint Master certification process. And I can't remember who it was, but one of the organizers or mentors there said, if you come into a sprint with, like you said, Bryce, a preconceived notion of the solution, do you really need a sprint? Right. And so that definitely sort of has been one of the precursor, one of the constant things when I do retrospectives about, how the sprint works, or which ones failed and which ones didn't. But baked into the process of design sprints in itself, as you are, defining what the challenge statement is, as you're defining what objectives and goals that you're looking to figure out, you're not just looking at what success looks like for your vision or your goal or your objective. You should be also looking at what failure looks like. What is, and whenever you say that out loud with folks, it takes a little bit of mapping. It's like, so what does failure for the solution look like? That opens a new can of worms. So we always look at certain solutions that are built and mature, that even with machine learning applications, most notably recently, where it can be co-opted and used for nefarious reasons. And so that should be part of the conversation. What is the game theory sort of ethos? What's the best thing that could happen if we fail, or how do we go about resolving or just not going down that path? That should be part of that early conversation. And as you're sort of thinking that out loud.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. As a designer, I'm typically in demand in the design sprint because they want, the interface or somebody to prototype or ideate and things like that. And I've learned that I can't run one and participate in one at the same time. Like that's a no-go. Because if I do that, it's too easy for me to force my favorite ideas through, even if they're not good. But if you follow the design process, it's going to actually get you a yes or no out the other end instead of, well, Bryce liked this one, so that's kind of where we went. But it's weird because I realized that you have a outsized amount of control. And different people in the organization will have outsized amounts of control as well and cause a sprint to
the loudest person in the room. I remember going through one of the courses, and the professor said it was a data related product management data related course, and the instructor goes, well, if you have data, use that. If you have opinions, use mine. And because he's the most influential person in the room. And so think about that at scale, like every person who's both participating and either facilitating or influencing it, design sprints bakes in a way for us to converge when we need to converge and work together, and diverge in things like prototyping in order to, in an unbiased way, dot voting as an example, which is a term that is used to help remove that bias of that most influential person.
Yeah, I mean, think your boss walks into the room and says, "No, I think we should do it this way." You're going to listen, right? Well, like Noble said, the design sprint has this these cool structures that are part of it that sort of break that down and stop you from doing those things.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
something.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say it's something very important about the design sprint is whomever's running it has no influence. They're just helping the flow continue. There's no they have, as Bryce mentioned, without having any input on a decision or design, how tough is that to not want to help, guide a particular decision or influence. I've participated in a design sprint, but I've never ran one myself. So, how tough is that to, I'm sure after you've ran hundreds that it kind of gets, normal at that point, but
it's really easy if you have defined roles. Mm-hmm. The place that I really bump into problems is that I am often in the organizations that I work with, I'm often considered the strategist or the idea producer, or take your pick on those roles. But that way, when that group is in the room, then they think, oh well, Bryce is going to contribute to the ideas, he's going to contribute to these processes. If I say no, I'm running this, it's my job to be separate, then it's all fine.
You're just facilitating and guiding.
Yeah.
You're not.
It's if I get into the trap of, oh yeah, I'm part of that team too, then it's really hard. And I haven't found a good way to take my bias out.
Gotcha.
There's also a role for what they call the decider, right? And so often in running these things a few times over the years, you come up with multiple great solutions if you're lucky, right? You hit a stalemate. Like, is this solution? You go through the whole process, 2 days, whatever, 3 days, 5 days, and you come up with a solution, and you start asking, or the group starts asking themselves, like, well, this deviated. Like, how did we get to this point? But there's a role for the decider, your boss, or whoever you nominate, right? So as part of just riffing off of Bryce, your point is that person, like the role is called, is the super vote, right? And comes in and tries to break the tie, or can say this did not work, and so let's figure out why. Mm-hmm. We went to try to figure out how to redesign our coffee shop. By the way, design sprints are not just for digital software. And when we did, we thought we were tackling the right problems, but we learned that, there was a pandemic and no one was going to come in anyway. So maybe we should use our resources elsewhere.
Interesting. So, pardon me, you talked about roles. So Bryce was talking about the sprint master, the one who's leading the design sprint. Noble, you mentioned the decider as a role. What are can you help define for us what are the roles of a design sprint? Like, how, if I were to run one or participate in one, what roles should I expect to play?
I mean, it's intentionally quite vague in what roles are expected. I have found, working with smaller organizations and smaller groups, that the prototyper role, or the person who's capable of creating a prototype, is often missing. Depending on the organization, you might have that person available. I always try to bring in people with different perspectives on the problem and the user. One of my first calls is actually to support. I always ask the support team to send me somebody. Somebody talks to the people who are actually having problems with this thing. Otherwise, it's nice to have a designer in the room. It's nice to have a business analyst. It's nice to have a product owner. But it doesn't really matter, right? It's just those people that are willing to chew on the problem and try to come up with a better solution. The decider, actually, like Noble mentioned, can be anybody. It doesn't have to be the person in charge. It doesn't have to be the
superior
or the C-suite or somebody like that. Sometimes there's a product champion, right? Who really cares about this thing. And sometimes that's the person we pick as the decider. The facilitator, and both Noble and I have been talking about this from that perspective. Think of the facilitator like a referee. It's really that person's job to make sure that people stay on task and that the decider actually casts their votes and, things like that. Not other than that, I step back a lot. At least I try to.
Gotcha. Noble, you mentioned dot voting as a possible solution to helping guide things. Is that just one of the tools in the tool belt, or are there other ways that you've used to help? All right, we've reached this stage in the design sprint. Now we need to move on to the next phase. Like, what are some ways to? All right, we're done. We need to make the call. Dot voting it, or what other solutions have you used to keep things going?
So look at dot voting as just say like a tricky way to prioritize what's important at a specific time, so that you can just prioritize in a fast track way to just sort of, get to what to focus on early in the process. And then later when you have a couple prototypes and you want to sort of vote on the solution, you do the same thing. All the dot voting piece of that larger design sprint process is doing is giving the audience in the room a heat map of where where our assumptions came from versus where we think either the problem space, the focus area for the problem space that we need to focus on, or later on the heat map where it's sort of centralized to with all the dots on the solution space and where we want to focus in on as well. But I wanted to riff off of something that I'm sorry, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to riff off as I'm known to do off of something that Bryce said. So yes, I've also found that prototypers are often hard to come by, but I don't think it's that important, depending on what you're trying to do. Sure, if it's an experimentation sprint and it's sort of digital software, you got a problem that you just can't crack. It's funny you mentioned time zones. Because working in the healthcare field with the federal government centralized in the Washington, D.C. metro area. In my case, at the time, I was working for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And so, you've got, patients and providers and hospices and different provider types spread out all over 53 states, including territories, right? They all used a legacy software, a mainframe where they had to VPN in. So time zones were never an issue because you always VPN into DC, right? Or VPN, remote desktop is the right VPN and remote desktop into the thing. That is a thing until the web prompted, a chance to modernize that. So now you had a unique problem. As you're going through the modernizing, you don't just turn off the old thing and turn on the right thing. So a design sprint would have been, we didn't use that for that problem, would have been perfect to isolate just for that problem. And it could have been either an engagement sprint or something known as an engagement sprint, which is just basically, all right, we're not really delivering a prototype at the end of this thing to validate, but we just want to just drive collaboration around this problem. Just get like a SWAT team or a Tiger team around this thing. And so there's an engagement type of sprint. There's also a strategy sprint that doesn't have a prototype output. So you really don't need a prototyper, but you need the right type of roles, like Bryce said. And then, of course, a realization sprint, like we have no idea how to tackle this thing. So the different flavors of design sprints and knowing when to apply that, one method versus another at the right time is very essential and something you should definitely look up.
Gotcha. I wonder if this falls into the prototyper kind of role, but most of the audience and most of the developer community, they have the software engineering background. And Bryce, you and I have chatted about this on another call where a lot of developers don't necessarily show up to designer events and Adobe events or insert graphic design artist event here kind of events. I'm an engineer myself, so as you can tell, I haven't shown up to these as well. But so when I hear the term design sprint, I mean that's typically you're going to get the focus on, oh, this is all design. It's not necessarily how can I make my code look prettier? How can I make my app work better? Why should as a developer should I be interested in a design sprint?
We've co-opted the word design to be visual, and even more so lately to be on a screen. Mm-hmm. And that is very much not true. I look at history, like Da Vinci is one of my heroes. I would call Da Vinci a designer, right? Because he used this process of creativity to solve problems and to come up with a solution. Design sprints are actually kind of awesome because they take the importance of the designer away. Right? They're just a way of coming up with ideas. So everybody's involved there, right? Everybody's got ideas. Everybody can come up with solutions. And there's some, I love scaring people because one of the exercises is to draw things, right? You like make little squares on a piece of paper and you draw stuff, and everybody says, well, I can't draw anything. Can you use boxes and arrows to communicate your idea? If so, you're drawing something, and that's all we need.
A little flow chart connecting boxes, triangles, circles.
Square, right? It can be anything you want. So I think I kind of wish we'd take the name design out or stop thinking of design as only visual, because you build an architecture for something. You figure out the correct data sources and responses for a feature. You write code and you modularize it so that it does things. You could have a design sprint on a code block. It's all about understanding if the thing that you're trying to do is solving the problem that you set out to solve.
Kyle, I think if you've had that issue a lot where a lot of developers don't attend this workshop because it's called a design sprint, perhaps you should do a design sprint about
that. Touche.
I love that Noble is proving that literally anything can be applied to a design sprint.
Anything with a design sprint. Which, that funny question. I have noticed, so let me get to a question from the audience really quick before I get to my question. But oops. Looks here from Gaston. What is the biggest or fondest memory you've had when you first started out your careers, whether if it was a technical problem, a eureka moment, or a solution right underneath your nose?
And
I believe that's to either of you.
Well, I'll start. I have a pretty short answer. The best part of my early career, my fondest moment, is actually looking back and realizing the stuff that I thought I was going to struggle with was not the things that I struggled with, and learning how and where to apply creativity in a process. I got to admit, I've got a graphic design background. I look back at my portfolio from design that I was super proud of in design school, and I can't believe that I showed that to people. So I think it's everybody goes through it. I don't know that I have a specific eureka moment, but I definitely, looking back, there's plenty that I've learned, and I think the eureka moment is knowing that and applying it somewhere else.
Gotcha. How about I see Noble's still.
Noble's really thinking about
the wheels are still spinning.
Such a great question. I wouldn't say, I don't remember because I have a short memory. I don't remember my earliest. I guess the question is not about the earliest, but the biggest, fondest memory that I had. But when I started my career, I'll say when I started my second startup, the new career path as a founder, I was lucky enough to be a launch partner, Google Glass launch partner for GDE's, or sort of the GDE's, the Glass Development Program, I think it was called. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And with that cushion, and drinking the Kool-Aid, like understanding that, or really truly believing that glass was going to be something in 2020, just go to your optometrist and just add smarts to your prescription. I started a company around that. So just for background, one of the fondest memories and realizations that I came out of that, like it wasn't so much of a technical problem, because that, to me, that is normally the easy stuff, because, with a little bit of training, but I actually didn't know the first thing about design sprints or design thinking. I was solving the problem for me. I had a gastro problem back in 2011 or 12, and I needed to change my habits. And so eating well led to fitness. And so my startup was around fitness, and I was trying to get a virtual assistant thing for fitness. I spent so much time solving the problem for me because I believed that there were many me's out there. Like, I'm using an app, and every time the workout is done, I have to pick up my phone and go to the next one and see how to do it, versus a virtual thing within my field of view. As I'm doing pull-ups, it's just talking to me and counting for me. That was a novel idea. What I didn't do was talk to people, validate if some of the patterns that I was using, validate if the best question, the eureka moment after I failed was, how am I solving this problem better than 10x, better than the problems out in the market today? And
that's important, right? It's got to be 10x. It can't just be a little bit better.
Yeah, and because you've got a lot of headwinds. You're the new person. You're a startup, no name. You've got a lot of incumbents that are massive and will eat you for lunch. What you're doing, in my case, was super emergent technology that was $1,600 just to get a pair at the time, and so there were lots of hurdles to just get traction with it, right? And if you got that traction, now prove to me that I'm investing not only in your painkiller, but in the medium by which you're delivering this painkiller, right? So by injection, well, I don't like injections. Like, I want candy. I want something that I know I'm not supposed to do, but it's so addictive. I just want to get healthy. He makes it super easy. So yeah, that I don't know whether that answers the question directly, but yeah, that was definitely what sort of sparked my love for, just understanding the problem and being more collaborative with the customers and users as part of that process.
That's super cool too, because that problem understanding applies to everything. I worked for a startup, and we all sat in a room, and we decided that we didn't have a product market fit. We should have come up with that first. But it's the hardest thing I've ever done to say, yeah, you know what? People like this thing we have. People want it, but they told us they'd never pay for it. So we don't have a valid business.
Interesting. Yeah, that is always kind of the tough part whenever, especially if you're very close and passionate about a project. And so to bring that back to design sprints. Yeah. Design sprints focus that passion, right? They help you to discard the stuff that, like Noble was talking about, doesn't matter, and focus on the things that do, because you're supposed to test it.
Right.
Yes. Right? You're supposed to show it to people. You're supposed to get that feedback. When do you introduce the design sprint process? Let's say, for example, there's a developer watching that they're realizing, oops, we should have ran this. Is it too late to run a design sprint, or to help kind of right the ship, if you will, or when should you run? There's ideally, and
I mean, I think a lot of the time we look at design sprints as a big problem solution. That's going to depend on the organization and everything. What's too late look like? Well, what's your runway look like? What does how many investors are lining up? How long before you have
not necessarily if you're a startup, but let's say you're working on this as a let's say you're doing a hackathon, or you're a large enterprise company that wants to roll something new out. So like where
yeah, right. So
runway's not a factor.
Why not use it for V5 as you're making updates and changes and improving what you offer? There's no reason that you have to say the ship has sailed. You can just say, well, we
or the ship is sunk.
Use it last time and maybe we should have, so let's try it next time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think once all other familiar methods have exhausted, or at least have been tried, that's perhaps one path to do it. And then there are also, since they're different kinds of sprints, there are also, as Bryce was alluding to, for my example that I gave, the knee jerk would have been, I hope I didn't give the impression that had I had a chance to do it again, I would have done the design sprint for the product. Perhaps not. And so when you're thinking as to when should I introduce it, first figure out what your roadmap is. Like, what are you trying to, like, what's the maturity of your product? All right. Maybe I'm going too far back into strategy, but like, what are the major things within your experience that, depending on your strategic objectives, would benefit from differentiating, as an example, your business or your solution or your product from the competitor? So think about like just sort of, the differentiator factor would be a great, you're thinking you want to innovate. I have to use that word 3 times, even though I hate it, but you want to sort of do something that is unique enough in your V5, I think you mentioned, or whatever, what have you, or solve a specific narrow problem, either with your CI/CD pipeline or your MLOps process, or just the interface, something that will put you at a competitive advantage, maybe, or just solve the problem in a unique way that if there are 100 task management tools, maybe they will have a second look at it. As one long, convoluted example. What would that be? And then slice that, create a challenge statement that is grounded with a real problem that you want to solve. And then see whether you can, reach an actual customer that has given you feedback that, I love your app, but I don't want to join your business or subscribe because, there's no need. I have Trello, right? Yeah. So what are you doing different? Like, how can you add? So that's where maybe a design sprint. But I think, again, like I said, if you're successful at some level, anything that is differentiating becomes table stakes. It becomes normal. And so that cycle of just not trying to die, whether you're an established business, no runway problems, you just want to keep competitive. It's always good to bake design sprints as part of your process. It doesn't have to be every agile sprint period. It can be every quarter. It can be based on when there is a specific need. But always
major releases versus minor releases.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I do want to pull really quickly one more from the audience, because I wanted to direct this one at Noble, because Noble, you really dove into your how your app with Google Glass, how you didn't use design sprints, you kind of wished you might have at some point in certain parts of it, but and Bryce, I'll let you answer after Noble on this one, but Natalia asks, is there any work or project that you're most proud about that you can you can refer back to it as a good use of design sprints?
Great question. And I was prepared for this question if it came up. So one I'm most proud of is a project called Dem Games. And Dem Games was a gaming platform of sorts, because it wasn't just the solution wasn't just on mobile. It was also on a voice action for Google Home or Alexa. But it was a gaming platform that complemented certain assessment tools around civic and voter education principles that the National Democratic Institute, again, long nonprofit, international, one of the larger international development organizations out there. But we had beneficiaries out in Guatemala Guatemala has this unique case where a lot of the people in politics are older, and the youth voice is normally cut out. And so there was a program, that we had at NDI that went to help motivate youth and get youth focused on re-engagement with the content. And the content was just paper and all that stuff. And so this challenge was to bring that to a mobile device. Fun fact, most youth with the means, college level educated youth that would be prime personas for running, for office, had a cell phone. And some of them had a smartphone. And so the challenge was to solve this for them. And so we went through that, process with the design sprint. We actually did a full sprint in this case, where we had, dialed in, we did a hangout with our team in Guatemala. Our chief innovation officer at the time came through and just gave us the long-term vision as to what he would like to see. He didn't want to bias the solution, but just wanted to talk about the problems with the paper-based approach to, the programs that we're running, the assessment tools that we're running with civic and voter education out there. And then we went through the whole design sprint process. And as a result, we came out of the sprint with prototypes that were validated. We went in with some assumptions that were completely repudiated. And so the solution was just a simpler sort of form-based thing that connected with educators around the world through this simple app interface. And so you had a situation where, students could just take that in-class thing with them wherever they went, and sort of got them more motivated and sent push notifications to them when there was new content, that kind of stuff. And we defined at the time where Dem Games would be 6 months to 5 years. And so we baked that into the thought process, what success looked like and what failure looked like when we went through that process. And today the program is still thriving. I'm no longer with the organization, but last I checked, Dem Games is now in multiple other countries. I can remember. I can give a number right now. I don't want to be misquote the fact, but it's in multiple countries, probably Nigeria and other places where Dem Games is actually an open source solution that other organizations can sort of take and run with. Yeah.
Awesome. And they're carrying your design sprint method.
Yeah. So
in that.
It's funny because the design sprint method became a product, quote unquote, on its own because of our first ever, international development led design sprint, for this big problem that we had, because you had a lot of pressure. We're trying to solve this problem from the National Endowment for Democracy, our major funder, State Department, that kind of stuff. And so we sort of documented all the things that worked. Bryce, you mentioned something very earlier on, as in we didn't follow the process to a T. So we actually had to come back and sort of fix that along the way. We did multiple sprints, multiple phases of our solution. So we learned retrospectives and learned and improved along the way. But that's one of my proudest moments, because you can sort of see the impact from day one or day 5 of the initial validation with actual people interfacing with something that was just put together with duct tape and rope, but still so useful. So yeah.
It's so just kind of like trickled down, and now it's this global initiative. Very cool.
Right.
Awesome. How about you, Bryce?
Yeah, well, Noble, I love that you kind of mentioned just very briefly there that the design sprint process helped you simplify. And I think that in my mind, that is one of the best indicators that you should use a design sprint. As humans, we're really, really good at coming up with super complex solutions to a lot of really complex problems. And it turns out those are never the right solutions. Those are just the ones that we come up with. So one of my favorites is kind of that same sort of thing. A friend of mine runs a nonprofit organization that basically trains at-risk high school students to become entrepreneurs. The way it works is they get a small investment to come up with an idea, and then they can go back and ask for more money when they show results and things like that, right? So I got a t-shirt company, and I want to get like a little investment to do a first printing run, and then I've got I want more to do marketing, and I want to get influencers involved and whatever, right? There's this process of running a business. But the director was talking to me, and she kind of said, well, I don't know how to help these high school students track at what point they should go back for more investment. What does that process look like? And it's like, well, I think we can use a design sprint for this. This feels like a place where it'll make sense. And pro tip, you're not supposed to be freaked out as the facilitator and not quite know what you're doing. But I came into this and I'm like, okay, I got a bunch of high school students who are kind of new to this program that they're part of. The program isn't super flushed out about what they're asking for. Like this sounds like a mess, right? Well, it turned out we went through a week-long design sprint, all 5 days, with these high school students in the room. Not only did they completely simplify the problem down to something that we could actually run a sprint against, but they came up with really cool ideas of things that would track them and motivate them both to continue this loop of like learning and investment and stuff like that. And that was kind of my favorite, just because I know that a website or a brand or a strategy or whatever is going to work just fine in a design sprint. And I had no idea going in if this one was going to work, but it turned out that I think we taught 10 high school students a life skill that they could use over and over again outside of this thing.
Awesome.
They're not all like that, but every once in a while you get a fun one.
That's extremely cool, because you can, this goes to show too that design sprints are for anyone on any project kind of thing. Like it's not just for building an app. It's not just for, working on something digital. You can also carry it into other projects as well. So that's it, at any age level as well. So that had to be both fun and challenging at the same time, trying to, take everything at a high school level, so to speak. So I
actually know somebody who was running design sprints with elementary school children. So
oh, wow.
The process is really not that complicated, and it probably works better before we've been taught how to be creative.
Right.
So that does bring up the next question I want to pull from the audience here. So this is from Daniel. Any tips for doing this in a virtual environment? So, as we all know right now, most of us are still work from home. All three of us raise our hand. So when you're running a design sprint, typically, it's when you get all of the minds in the same room and you're able to converse in real time. So how is it? Have you tried running a design sprint yet virtually? What's it like? Any, as the question goes on, it seems to be difficult to get everybody in a meeting. They're balancing school, work, family life. So, what have you found to work well in this virtual world?
I could go first, Bryce. I'd love to hear.
I was going to say, that's a tough question.
So remote sprints basically are a thing. They're actually agencies. I've noticed sort of in order to stay afloat, have still been passing on the values of a workshop like design sprints or basically tweaking different, just adapting with the times that we're in. So remote sprints, virtually are a thing. It happens day in and day out. I've done one in my career, not because of a pandemic, but it was you can technically, with the example that I gave earlier, it was partially remote because we couldn't fly our end users from Guatemala to the US. And so throughout the week, we had elements of a remote sprint. Now, as far as the pandemic today, yes, absolutely, Daniel, it is 100% difficult to get everyone in a meeting, yet another Zoom thing. And how long are we going to do this? We're going to do this a week? No way. A couple things to remember. Buy-in. If the problem is important enough to be resolved and you have, look at myself as a product manager, if I've done my job as a product leader well, I have done nothing but motivated the heck out of every single person and made them want to solve this problem in a different way if they're not familiar with the sprint. So that's the first thing. But buy-in also means going to leadership and just justifying why it needs to happen so that they can actually give folks a break from the day-to-day churn of what we do in order to sort of think with the different part of their brain if they have to during this design sprint period. So that's what you do before the sprint.
I'm gonna jump in real quick. Don't lose your train of thought, Noble. But that is what you would do for any design sprint. It doesn't matter if it's remote or not.
Well, yeah, right? yeah. But it is 100%, and it is even more so. Definitely get validation. Get buy-in from the right people. And make, just sell it to your groups. And then once you do that, I mean, design sprints tend to be very rigid, very time boxed. Bryce has a time timer, it's blurred out and behind him. In order to really get to value without just spending too much time, having too much conversations about this, design sprints are structured in a way to sort of keep things down. That is a little difficult in a time like this, right? I actually had to buy Mario 3D and Bowser's Fury on Nintendo Switch for my 3 and 6 year old. And that's why you don't hear noises right now. They're in the basement and they're having dinner, they're eating pizza and playing Bowser's Fury. It's going to be grease all over. But that's, I don't know how I got onto that. But yeah, the whole thing is the realities of living, working from home or living at work, however you're going to look at it, presents itself. All that to say, I have no idea how to solve that problem. That's just, if you figure it out, Daniel.
Tips and solutions that you figured it
out. I've never dealt with a remote sprint during a pandemic, but Daniel, that's a problem that I'll be interested in learning from those who are facilitating to try to solve, because that's a real human problem. Yeah.
Do either of you follow Jason Fried, Basecamp?
Yeah.
He's been writing for years and years about running a business fully remote. This pandemic thing wasn't new for Basecamp. They just kept rolling business as usual. But I actually like a lot of the theories that he has for normal running of business for doing design sprints as well. For example, he's a big proponent of making everything asynchronous, but putting it somewhere that people can engage with it, right? So the entire team can see it, even though they're not necessarily in the same place. He always takes it a step further and says asynchronous because, time zones and things like that. Doesn't matter what the tool is, Trello, Basecamp, Google Doc, putting something up that the entire sprint team can access, in my experience, has actually made it somewhat easier to get people to do things, right? If I say, Kyle, join us right now for an hour and do this thing, right? You've got issues with the stuff going on in your life and timing and stuff like that. If instead I say, Kyle, you've got an hour, do this exercise and then post your result here. And then in another hour or 2 hours, we're going to get together. Tomorrow, we're all going to get together and we're going to vote on which of these we liked best. Right? There's some challenges to that, but you're actually not influenced by the stuff that everybody else is doing around you. So in a way, it gets you cleaner and better conversations and ideas. That's one of my tricks. The other one is, like a Google Jamboard where you can actually put up Post-it notes on a screen and sort of replicate the concept of a Post-it note wall or things like that. But we have a lot of tools. I think the problem we bump into is not the remote design sprint. It's thinking that a design sprint can only work in a room with everybody else. As soon as you go away from that, you got a bunch of tools. You use them all the time anyway, right? So why not just apply them to a different problem and be happy about it?
I really like what you said about, how your approach to it was give them a time hour to themselves whenever it is, and instead of being structured where everybody has to sit on a quiet virtual call, ideating amongst themselves. That seems, you said it's been working for you, and I can see how it would, because, you're giving them that time, that space. They find that hour, within that work-life family balance, including school. And, but then you have that structured time where, all right, everybody come back together, and then, make sure your idea has been posted to this Jamboard or whatever tool that you're using. And then, so that use that time more efficiently as a structured time. That makes a lot of sense, running it virtually. So that way, it's being more efficient with everybody's time. Because I know one of the things that, I'm probably, everybody has been seeing this, with the increase of the work from home, there's been a lot more virtual meetings, a lot more meetings that, and I know I've seen the memes flying across online, like, did this really need to be a meeting? Then it could have been an email, stuff like that. And so I really liked that, like how you mentioned that approach to where, instead of making it a meeting, just here's the email, here's your task, make sure it's done by, like, you still give them that due date,
right?
That structure as a facilitator.
Yeah, you need that. You need that agreement that this is actually going to happen and that you're going to prioritize it. Which, to Noble's point earlier, is one of the biggest reasons that you get the leadership and management of an organization bought in beforehand, right? They have to say, like, if we're doing a design sprint, Kyle, your manager has to say this is a priority, get it done, right? If that doesn't happen, then all those other meetings that you were going to go to start to take priority, and your hour doesn't show up.
Right.
But as long as that's happening, as long as it's a priority for the organization, personally, I kind of think the remote one's better.
Sometimes in the software engineer world, it depends, varies company to company, but one of the fun, the best terms I've heard for this from a software engineer side is a codecation, where you do take, you get that approval from the manager and stuff like that, where you have time to where you can go hack away at a project, and similar to what you're talking about with the design sprint, but it's you could work with a colleague or something like that to hack on a project. But I can see where even as software engineers, taking in this design sprint methodology into this codecation as a way to help better.
I'm laughing at the idea
and it's not necessarily
for what they pay you
right.
for anyway.
Yeah, so it's not, it's a codecation in the sense that you've got approval from your manager to spend the next week focused, head down with you and by yourself or with a colleague to work on a particular, you want to test this theory with the product that you're currently working on, or you want to work on a new product, or you have a side project of, I want to learn a new language and I give myself a week to get through all the basics. Is this something that's going to benefit my team? And so there's many different ways that you can play with this codecation. But a lot of what we've been talking about, especially in the virtual aspect, it sounds to me, from a software engineering background, a lot like a codecation. So I'm trying to help translate to the other developers that are tuning in and stuff like that.
Vacation, but code. I love it.
Yes. And unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. Those of you who are tuning in, if you do have more questions for our two guest speakers, Bryce and Noble, feel free to, we did have a lot of great comments. I see a couple more streaming in here, but we did have a lot of great comments. If you do have more questions for Bryce and Noble, feel free to reach out to us or keep asking them in the chat, and we will make sure these questions get passed along to Noble and Bryce. Very happy to have both of you here to take time out of your evenings to join us on Between the Brackets. Out of your day. I know you mentioned kids are at dinner, trying to keep them quiet and stuff like that. So definitely appreciate both of you taking the time to come here, especially on a live show. It's been great.
Right.
And want to remind everybody about our programs that both Bryce and Noble are involved in, like our Google developer groups, the Google Developer Experts Community, Women Tech Makers, and our Developer Student Clubs. You can find more about this at the link below, g.co/dev/community. We have all the information about our programs on there. We also have a recently launched program here in North America called the Accelerator Program, which helps to highlight and educate startups in US and Canada. So very exciting stuff there. And last but not least, we do have, I do have another announcement after this too, but tune in next month on March 18th for our next session, DevOps for Web Apps on Google Cloud, where we will have Martin Omander joining us to talk about how to work with DevOps on Google Cloud. And with all of this, I wanted to also thank my co-host. So I realize I may have forgotten to introduce myself at the very beginning. I am Kyle Paul with the Google Developer Relations team here in North America. And with me backstage are Madusha Kure and Danny Fiorello, who are helping run the show, answering, responding to you in chat, helping to make sure the streams are going well, and all that stuff. So check us out on Between the Brackets. If you want to tune into more great shows like this. All of this is recorded on our YouTube channel, but it's always great to have you live asking questions to our experts that we bring on each month. It's very fun. We have a lot of engaging conversations, and we get to learn a lot. I want to highlight one of the comments, that was mentioned in here. I never knew the proper terminology until today. So I've heard about it before. The proper description, everything that we talked about today was yes. Somebody was clicking on it. There we go. Oh yes.
I'm not going to plug it because it's not my book necessarily, but the foundation for all the design sprints is in there. It's a book called Sprint by a guy named Rick Knapp, who used to be a Googler, I believe. But yeah, all the like background stuff that we kind of touched on but blazed past is in there.
Awesome. And there's more. If you go to the Google Design Sprint website, you can learn a lot more. But definitely, if you have any questions, we will more than happily pass them along to Noble and Bryce, and we'll get those answered for you. So thank you all for tuning in. And thank you again, Noble and Bryce, for joining us tonight. It was great having you. And I know I learned a lot about design sprints. So hopefully, and I know everybody else did too. There's a lot of amazing comments happening in the chat
as well. And this was my prodcation as well. So
Nice.
podcation and codecation.
Sprintcation.
So thank you. Thank you all so much.
all right. Take care.
Thanks, Kyle.
Cheers.